Okay, let's get started. Thank you everybody for coming. I know everyone's really busy, and so thanks for joining us on your lunch hour. I'm Amy Barnhorst. I'm the director of the BulletPoints project, who's hosting this webinar series on firearm violence, suicide, and injury prevention for healthcare providers. And we are going to kick off our first in a webinar series today. These will be taking place every third Tuesday of the month at noon Pacific. I just learned it's actually Pacific Daylight Time, not Pacific Standard Time, but West Coast time at noon. They'll be about half an hour long with some time for Q&A at the end, so that people still have some time left over to do what else they need to do. So we'd love it if you join us in this informal setting to learn a little bit more about firearm injury prevention. Today, we are going to kick off our first webinar with Rocco Pallin, who is the education director here at the BulletPoints project. And she's a research data analyst at the UC Firearm Violence Research Center, which houses our work at the BulletPoints project. Rocco has an MPH and focuses on firearm injury prevention, particularly for healthcare providers in the healthcare setting. She's going to give our first webinar talk about what you can do, how to have informed and respectful decisions. How to have reformed and respectful conversations with patients about the risks of firearm access and how you as clinicians can reduce that risk. So first thing before we start Rocco's talk, we're going to have a brief survey with a few questions for you, and then we'll have one follow-up survey at the end, and then we'll have time for Q&A. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A part of the Zoom feature, which is down at the bottom where the little captions are. I will look through those questions because there will likely be many duplicates and related things, and I will give some of them to Rocco to answer at the end as time allows. If you have other concerns, you can put them in the chat. As this is a webinar, the participants are muted, so you won't be able to reach out verbally, but put any concerns or questions in the chat and any questions for our speaker in the Q&A part. Okay, I think we're ready to get started with the survey.
Okay, I think no more votes coming in, so polling is good. And I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Let's see here. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Misha? Great. All right. So thanks for the introduction, Amy. As Amy said, I'm Rocco Pallin. I'm from the BulletPoints project. And today I'm going to cover our most essential content, which is what clinicians can do to reduce firearm injury and death. Please do use the Q&A function. We really want to hear from you, comments and questions. And then looking forward to talking with you at the end. So I'll start with some really brief background. First, firearm violence is a public health problem, and I don't think I need to convince you all of that. I expect that's a lot of why you've come today. But specifically, how does firearm injury and death affect public health? A substantial number of people in the US die from firearms each year. In the last couple of years, more have died from firearms than have died from motor vehicle collisions. Firearms are among the leading causes of death for young Americans. So they're the fourth leading cause of death for Americans ages 10 to 14, and the second leading cause of death for Americans 15 to 24 and 25 to 34. That's 2019 data. And these deaths are preventable. For example, 3/5 of firearm deaths are suicides. A small percent are unintentional injuries, but those may be reduced by reducing access to firearms for those who can't be safe with them, like kids. And addressing upstream factors that contribute to community violence may help prevent some firearm homicides. And then firearm deaths cost the country a lot of money. This includes direct costs like medical costs after the acute injury, but also significant economic costs after someone's recovered from that injury, physically recovered. But firearms ownership, access are common in the US, and there are more guns, there are guns in more than 1/3 of US households, and there are approximately the same number of guns as number of people in the US. And so guns are tools and have appropriate uses, and many guns are used safely. But we're living with guns. And I think the point here is that we don't have to live with so many gun injuries. Clinicians can help, though. Clinicians are uniquely suited to help reduce the risk of firearm injury and death in the patients that you see every day. Most basically, the clinician's role is to assess risk and, when it's clinically relevant, talk with patients about ways to reduce that risk. We don't advocate for universal counseling on firearms and safe storage because firearm access isn't universally clinically relevant. So the first step in talking with patients about risk and about access is identifying who is at increased risk. There are generally 3 categories of risk for firearm-related harm. The first category is certain demographic groups who are at higher risk. So practically and clinically, the demographic group that's at higher risk for which access is universally relevant is kids and teens, who are obviously at higher risk for unintentional firearm injury and also for older youth for firearm suicide. Then there are a number of individual risk factors for firearm-related harm that make access to firearms clinically relevant. So, for example, prior suicidal ideation and attempt, 33% of suicide decedents have a history of suicidal thoughts or plans, and 1 in 5 had made prior attempts. Then present or prior violence is a risk factor, and that doesn't just mean victimization or perpetration, but also exposure to violence. Substance misuse is a risk factor. Alcohol misuse, for example, is an established risk factor for self and other directed violence, including with firearms. And then serious and poorly controlled mental illness is a pretty minor risk factor for violence to others, but can be a notable risk factor for self-harm. Dementia and other cognitive impairments, so the cognitive and behavioral changes that happen with dementia can increase risk for firearm injury. And then those with abusive partners are at higher risk. The presence of a firearm increases by 5 times the risk that a domestic violence incident results in a fatality. And then there's this third category who are those with imminent risk of self or other directed harm, so present ideation or intent that is suicidal or homicidal. And these are separated out into this third category because when you're seeing a patient at imminent risk, you may need to consider other interventions that can quickly reduce access to firearms. So once you've identified risk and you know that firearms are clinically relevant, you'll need to introduce the topic to the patient and talk about why access to firearms is concerning. We know that clinicians want to be involved. They feel it's within their clinical responsibilities, but they do rarely assess risk and talk with patients about access to guns when it's relevant. And there are certainly barriers to having these conversations. So I'm gonna address some barriers. I'm gonna first list some barriers and then address some barriers with the hopes that you'll become more comfortable opening these conversations and making recommendations to patients that will help keep them more safe. So some of the barriers are competing clinical priorities. So really that means time constraints. Then legal considerations. So concern for whether I can even legally ask a patient about access to firearms. Then there's also concern for alienating patients. This can be perceived as a political conversation, an intrusive question if you ask about access to firearms. And then gaps in training and knowledge. And so that includes unfamiliarity by clinicians with the benefits and the risks of owning firearms, with identifying those at higher risk, with what to say when you're bringing up the topic of firearms or asking about access and talking about strategies to reduce risk. So I'm going to go into these in more detail, but we've kind of already begun to address the first item in this list, which is time constraints, by recommending that if it's not clinically relevant, you don't ask about access to firearms. So take a targeted approach and ask when someone is at risk. So next to legal considerations, there are no state or federal statutes that prohibit these conversations between clinicians and patients. And so although firearm policy can feel kind of messy and be difficult to navigate and can vary a lot by state, this, I think, is the most important point for clinicians, that there aren't any policies prohibiting these conversations. And then next, what do patients think? Clinicians have concern for alienating patients. And like I said, that's at least in part because firearms can seem like a charged topic, and clinicians might worry that patients will feel conversations about firearms and access are intrusive or inappropriate. But clinicians are trained and kind of expected to talk about personal or intrusive topics in the exam room when that's clinically relevant. And on top of that, people indicate that they're open to having these conversations with their clinicians. So for example, in a large nationally representative survey study that looked at thousands of adults across the country, 2/3 of respondents said that these conversations were appropriate in general. And that included more than half of gun-owning respondents. And then in a similar California study, where we asked especially about when someone in the home is at increased risk, adults overwhelmingly reported that these conversations were appropriate. So for example, 90% of adults said such conversations were appropriate when someone in the home was having thoughts of suicide. And 84% of adults said the conversations were appropriate when someone in the home, when children or teens lived in the home. So patients generally think these conversations are appropriate. And there are some things to consider when having conversations about risk and access to firearms related to gun ownership and firearms themselves. So first, firearm ownership is sometimes a part of a person's identity, a patient's identity. And this can affect how people store their firearms or their willingness to have someone else hold on to their firearms if they're going through a tough time and they should be separated from them to reduce their risk. Another consideration is that nearly 2 in 3 gun owners own guns for self-protection, at least own a gun in part for self-protection. And so we know that people who own for self-protection are less likely to store their guns locked up and unloaded in the most secure and inaccessible way. And third, these can be perceived as political conversations, like I already mentioned a little bit. So when talking to gun owners, messaging should acknowledge and also respect the role that firearms play in people's identities. These conversations that you're having are really just about reducing risk for those who are at higher risk. And you can remember that many gun owners really do take firearm safety and safe storage seriously. Second, there are ways to safely store firearms and keep them quickly accessible. So for example, a quick access lockbox, like one that uses fingerprint technology, or a quick access code that can be punched in and the box opens very fast, makes firearms inaccessible to people at risk, like kids, but keeps guns quickly accessible to owners who might want them readily available. And then third, there's really no place for politics in these conversations. These conversations are just about health and safety. So if politics comes up, your job as the clinician is to redirect the conversation and emphasize again that the shared goal is on reducing the risk of harm from firearms. Okay, so once you've identified someone at risk, what can you say? How do you open a conversation? First, it's important to establish the context. Explain who is at risk, so whether it's the patient or someone else in the patient's home, and what type of harm you're worried about. So it might be self-harm, it might be other directed harm, it might be unintentional injury, but make the context, the risk context clear. Next, use appropriate language. Words can be important when we're talking about firearms, when we're talking about firearm-related harm and safe storage and preventing injuries. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of appropriate language, but there are some considerations there. Then also know the safest way to store guns and know what other kinds of recommendations you can make if someone's at higher risk. Also, take a harm reduction approach. So that's an approach that is not judgmental and accepts that firearms are a part of some patients' lives. And then remember that when a patient takes steps, even if they're small steps, towards safer storage or toward the intervention that you have talked about, that's a win. And then tailor the recommendations to the patient. And so that can be things like who's at risk and for what kind of harm, who in the home owns the firearms, what type of firearms need to be safely stored or locked up, and what are the reasons that the person owns guns. Remember that trust is important, and these conversations might be more effective if they happen in an established clinician-patient relationship, although obviously that's not always possible. But engaging with trusted family members or peers of the patient can also help, especially when someone's going through a tough time and may need to have firearms out of the home temporarily. And then be aware of the policies that might be relevant in your area. Usually the relevant policies would have to do with what I just talked about, temporarily storing guns outside of the home for the duration of a crisis. But it can be important so that you make recommendations that are legal. There are a couple of approaches to opening the conversation about firearm access and risk and safety. And the one that you decide to take can depend on who your patients are, where you live. So if lots of people own guns where you live, you might take a different approach, and your comfort level with the different approaches. So generally, you can either ask whether there's a gun in the home, or you can assume that there's a gun in the home and go from there. Assuming there's a gun in the home may help to normalize the conversation about access and reducing risk. So here's an example of some phrasing that might work when someone is at risk of self-harm. And so the safest way to prevent a firearm injury is by getting guns out of the home temporarily until the crisis is past. So I'm not going to read the speech bubble, but here the clinician assumes that the patient has guns in the home and then asks about whether the patient will consider temporarily transferring. So the clinician mentions this is just temporary until the person is feeling better, and then asks whether this is something they'd be willing to consider. And then second, here's an example that's more of like a pediatric setting example. So the clinician establishes context by bringing up firearms the way they bring up other household hazards. So things like water heaters or medications. And again, this phrasing assumes that there are guns in the home, which may be preferred, because assuming there's a gun in the home might help you avoid the perception that you are passing judgment on someone's decision to own a gun. Another thing to note about this phrasing is that rather than asking about firearm safety or safe storage, the clinician really gets directly at the goal of the conversation in concrete terms, which is reducing access to those at risk. People might have different definitions of safe storage or secure storage, and so really like drilling down to the goal, which is reducing access, may be helpful. You can also try phrasing that's more like, tell me about how the firearms are stored in your home, or something like that. When no one is at acute risk of harm, safe storage is the appropriate recommendation. And so the safest way to store a firearm is unloaded, locked up using a locking device like a gun safe, a cable lock, or a lockbox, separate from ammunition when possible, and ideally ammunition is also locked up, and with the keys and combinations to the locking devices kept away from those who shouldn't have them. As I said earlier, language really matters. You want to be specific and you want to be technically correct. And so here are just a couple of considerations. First, when you're talking about storing firearms safely, if your recommendation is that all firearms are stored such that unauthorized users don't have access, talking about secure storage or safe storage is more specific than talking about gun safety. Gun safety is something that encompasses a wider range of behaviors with guns and use-related behaviors, like don't point the gun at anything you're not willing to shoot, or keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to shoot the gun. So really be specific and talk about safe storage. Then next, as I mentioned in that last example from the clinician, you can use the phrase reducing access to firearms when you're talking about your goals here, because that really is your goal. And so being specific about that goal may be helpful. And then third, using words like temporary and voluntary, especially when You might be talking to someone about getting guns out of the home, putting time and space between someone at acute risk and their firearms may be helpful. Using the word temporary also helps to emphasize that suicidal crises are often temporary in nature, and the word voluntary may help people retain a sense of agency. So if no one's at acute risk, then safe storage is the appropriate recommendation. And there are 4 common types of safe storage devices. And the types of guns that someone owns and the reasons for ownership can affect the way that people want to store their guns and the locking devices that they prefer to use. So I'm just really quickly going to show the 4 types. There are other kinds, but these are generally the 4 main categories. Lock boxes, this one uses fingerprint technology, so the box opens very quickly. Gun safes come in a wide range of sizes, as you can see here. Cable locks are small and inexpensive, available for free from a lot of places, law enforcement agencies and hospitals. And trigger locks are also small and inexpensive and make it so that a gun cannot be fired. So I'm giving a really brief overview today because we're going to do another webinar specifically on safe storage in a couple of months. I think I just have 2 other quick things. So if someone's at risk and safe storage won't really lower that risk, then talking about getting guns out of the home may be the next step. So if a gun owner is suicidal, even guns that are stored in the most safe manner can be accessible and even quickly accessible to the gun owner, him or herself. So talking about limiting access to lethal means can really help to save lives. And that means putting time and space between the person at risk and their firearms. In a lot of places, guns can be temporarily transferred to a family member or a trusted person. Background check requirements vary state by state on that. And then there are other options that include things like gun ranges, gun stores, pawn shops, law enforcement agencies. And in several states, researchers and clinicians are putting together lists of places that will consider temporarily holding on to someone's firearms while they go through a time of crisis. And so there are these gun storage maps for Colorado and Washington, Maryland, Mississippi. There are several other states, and I think more in the works. So those are really good tools for finding out where there is a business or an organization that will hold on to guns temporarily. And then finally, if voluntary and temporary transfer isn't an option, then further intervention might be warranted. And so there are extreme risk protection orders in 19 states, and those are civil temporary court orders that remove firearms from the person and remove their access to, or their ability to purchase firearms and ammunition for a specified time period. And then for some clinicians, mental health holds might be available for extreme situations of risk and can help people who are at risk of suicide or at risk of other directed harm get into psychiatric care. So a quick recap, a risk-based and targeted approach allows clinicians to help prevent firearm injuries. There aren't any state or federal laws that prohibit you from asking about access to firearms and talking about ways to reduce risk. The recommendations that you make depend on who's at risk for what type of harm and can also depend on the types of guns owned and the reasons that guns are owned. And finally, take a harm reduction approach and a collaborative approach. So work with patients to help reduce access in ways that are acceptable and realistic for them. And remember that small steps can really be big progress. For example, if you're talking with a patient who keeps a gun loaded and not locked up, and then you speak about safe storage and that patient starts locking up that gun, that's a win. That's a really big step, and that's keeping people at risk safer. So that's all I have. I think there's like another poll, and then we'll also answer some questions. Let's see. I'll just say while the poll gets going, for more information, you can I recommend you check out our website, which is thebulletpointsproject.org. And also you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and send us an email if there's anything that you have questions or comments on. And thanks. I think that's it for the screen sharing. So I will stop sharing. Okay. Okay, I think the poll is closing now. So Amy, do you have questions to share?
I got a few questions. One, somebody wanted to compliment you on pulling off a 30-minute webinar. Well done. Thank you for that feedback. I also got a couple just more logistical questions. Yes, this recording will be posted. It will be posted on our Bullet Points website, bulletpointsproject.org. It will be posted on our Twitter, on our Facebook feed, on our YouTube channel, all over the internet. So it will be out there. And as far as continuing education, we did not go through a process to get these webinars accredited, although someone mentioned that they thought there was a very low bar and we just needed to show attendance. If there's something that we all could give you to turn into your boards, we're happy to look into seeing if we can provide that. So send us an email and we'll look into it. We have a question about what do you say to a patient who declines to answer a question about guns?
Good question. I think what you say depends on the level of risk mostly. So if someone is relatively low risk, higher risk than no risk, but lower risk, and it's not an acute situation, I think you leave the door open for future conversation. So you can again emphasize that the reason that you're asking is only because you are concerned about safety, and that you want to talk with the patient about how to reduce the risk for that person or for people in their household. So I think first emphasize the context, the risk and safety focus. And then if you really aren't having a constructive conversation, then plan to follow up the next time you see that patient.
And then a related question, what about a patient who says, it's none of your business, stop asking me this stuff?
I think that's a similar situation. I think, again, emphasize risk, emphasize that this is just about safety. You can document people's answers, but you don't need to do that necessarily. I think that the clinicians may be served by sort of like stepping away from the computer, not typing things, like having a conversation and really emphasizing just the concern for safety. And that otherwise, this isn't about politics, it isn't about ownership, it's just about reducing the chance that someone gets shot.
Great. I think that is it for our questions now. Just to recap, folks can get more information and watch the recording of this on our website and on the Twitter feed and on our Facebook page and the YouTube channel. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And we hope to see you in another month on June 15th with Garen Wintemute, who's going to be talking about epidemiology of firearm injury. So third Tuesday in June.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.